Good evening and welcome to Parsha Tidbits, short and pithy teachings relating to the Parsha. The name of this week's Parsha is Emor, and it is situated in between two holidays. I was going to say minor holidays, but they're not minor at all. In fact, they have lessons that make them, in some ways, more major than what we call the major holidays. One of them that we just had yesterday was Pesach Sheni, second Passover. A month after first Passover is the second one, and the reason for this holiday is historical. In the Torah, there's a story of how certain individuals were told they cannot bring the Paschal lamb on the first anniversary of Passover, but when they complained, God said they can bring it a month later and make up for what they missed the month earlier. So this holiday is the holiday of making up, of teaching us that there is never too late to change, never too late to correct and rectify what we did wrong, to make up for what we missed in the past. That's one holiday. The day right after this Shabbos, on this Sunday, is Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the period known as Sviras Omer, the counting of the Omer. Very briefly, the Omer was a measure of barley that was brought in the temple on the second day of Passover. From that offering onward, we were commanded to count each and every day until the 50th day, which is the holiday of Shavuot, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. So the 33rd day of this counting, which is this coming Sunday, is called Lag BaOmer. Lag is simply Lamed Gimel, 33, because in Hebrew there are no numbers, the letters are numbers, and it's the 33rd day. And the significance of this holiday is historically based on two factors. The first, chronologically speaking, but not necessarily the main reason, is that Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, had 24,000 students who, because of their lack of respect for one another, according to the Talmud, perished in a terrible plague during this period. And on the day of Lag BaOmer, the plague ceased. And that's why we celebrate it as a day of rejoicing. The second reason, which is considered to be the primary reason, is that, ironically, Rabbi Akiva, the same Rabbi Akiva, after he lost his 24,000 students, went south, the Talmud says, and he acquired new students. The primary ones were 5 sages. Amongst them, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the great Kabbalist. He's also mentioned virtually every chapter of the Mishnah, one of the greatest sages of all times, and he's also the author of the Zohar, the primary and classic work of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. So what does it have to do with Lag BaOmer? The day that he passed away, he gathered some of his closest disciples and revealed to them secrets that he had never revealed before, and he said, this is the day of my wedding, my reunion of my soul with God, and therefore it should be a day of celebration. Well, he asked us to celebrate the day of his passing, and because of this, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews gather at his gravesite in Meron in the northern part of Israel and celebrate this day. So here are two holidays, and we're sandwiched in between those two holidays. I just want to note that this Parsha is a very unique one. It's unique because it contains all of the holidays. It starts with Shabbos and goes through all the holidays of the season, all the biblical holidays. And Kabbalah and Hasidus teach us that whenever we read in the Torah about a subject that might not be timely, we'll read about blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Today is not Rosh Hashanah, but if we read the Torah about it, we generate the same spiritual energy as the blowing of the shofar. If we'll talk about Sukkot, dwelling in a sukkah in the Torah, we generate the same spiritual energies that are connected with the sukkah. So this Parsha has all of the holidays contained in it. So this is a very powerful Torah reading that consolidates all the spiritual energies of all the different parts of the year. And I suggest that with such intense joy, concentrated and consolidated, this gives us the power to break out of all boundaries, because joy, we are told, breaks through boundaries. It lets us break out of the things that confine us and limit us. So many sources of joy together, so much holiness will certainly give us the power to get out of exile. Now, I mentioned that it has all the biblical holidays, but it also alludes to the rabbinical holidays, because right after it goes through all the holidays, it talks about lighting of the menorah. So what holiday does that allude to? Obviously, the holiday of Hanukkah, which is based on the miracle that happened with the menorah in the temple. What about Purim? Well, it doesn't seem to be any connection to Purim. But as we'll see, there is a connection to Purim, as well as to Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, as well as to Lag BaOmer. So let's start. The Parsha begins with the words, and God says to Moshe, Emor el ha-Kohanim b'nei Aaron v'yamarta oleihem. He says, say to the Kohanim, to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them. Well, it's redundant. So the question is asked by our sages, in the Midrash, the Talmud, Rashi quotes it, why does the Torah use this repetitive expression? Say to them, and say to them. In English, they translate them differently. Say to them and tell them, just to make it a little bit more consistent with the rules of proper writing, where you don't repeat the same phrase. But in the Torah, it uses the same phrase. Emor and amarta are the exact same root. They mean say. So that's the question about the repetition. It almost sounds like the rabbi who gets up before his congregation and says to them, before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. So what is this preliminary talk before the real talk? So there are many explanations, and I'll share some of the explanations with you. The one that Rashi quotes is that there are two different types of speech that God tells Moses to convey to the priests. Number one, you have to speak to the priests. Tell them what they have to do, the laws that concern the Cohen. Number two, they in turn, the adults in turn, have to admonish and teach the youth, the younger generation. So this is one of the sources of chinuch, education, that the Torah tells us that we have to not only speak to the adults, but the adults in turn have to speak to the youth, to the children. That's the repetitive expression. And we'll get back to that in a moment. Another answer, and this is the hint to the holiday of Purim. The Medrash says that we find another tautology like this, another repetition of the same expression. After King Achashverosh hears from his wife, Queen Esther, who she really is, and that she is going to be a victim of Haman's plot, it also uses a double expression, and the king says to her, and he says to her. So the Medrash says, why does it use this repetitive expression? And it answers, because before Achashverosh knew who Esther was, because Esther kept her identity a secret, he spoke to her through an interpreter. He did not speak to her directly. But once he discovered who she was, that she's a Jew, that she was a descendant of King Shaul, a monarch, he had more respect for her, and he spoke directly. So the two times speaking refers to the two different modes of speech that Achashverosh used when he communicated with Esther, which has a powerful lesson. And the lesson is that when does a Achashverosh, a heathen monarch, and by extension, all the nations of the world, have respect for the Jewish person when he doesn't hide his identity? There are many Jews, unfortunately, because of the suffering and persecution of exile, that have decided the best way to remain secure and safe is to hide their identities. That way they'll somehow mingle and assimilate, and they won't be targets. But you know what? A Jew cannot truly hide his or her identity. And the non-Jew looks askance at that and says, how could I respect someone who hides and doesn't respect his or her own identity? When the non-Jew, who looks for truth and integrity, sees the Jew proud of who he or she is, then he speaks directly. Then he has this direct communication. So we have here a hint to Purim as well, because the whole holiday of Purim came about when the Jewish people did try to assimilate. They came to the party that Ahasuerus threw for the entire populace of Shushan to celebrate, as it were, the defeat of the Jewish people and the ascendancy of his monarchy, in a position of strength. They'd bow down to an idol. True, they were forced into it, as the Talmud says, but there was a degree of assimilation where they would try to hide their identities. That's what brought about the threat against them. And when they exposed their identities and they showed their pride as Yehudim, the word Yehudi, which the source of the word Jew, means someone who acknowledges the one God and rejects all forms of idolatry and stands proud, that brought about the miracle of Purim. So we have an allusion to Purim in this double expression. And we also have the allusion to Hanukkah. We also have the allusion to Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. Why? Because the double expression is another parallel lesson to Pesach Sheni. What did we say Pesach Sheni was? You missed the opportunity first, you can make it up. Sometimes when you speak to someone and you don't get through to them, you despair. You say, what's the point? I already spoke to them. They're not listening. Why should I try again? The lesson is you never give up. Tenacity. You keep on talking. The Rebbe told us 25 years ago, and he said we are on the verge of the redemption. The time of the redemption has arrived. We are the threshold. And we need, the Rebbe said, people who are akshanim, stubborn. They don't give up. Yes, we expected Mashiach and redemption years ago. And we said then that it's imminent, that it's something that's going to happen. And it is happening. We can't give up. Pesach Sheni teaches us, you tried once and you failed, you try again and again and again. That's why the double expression. You speak, it doesn't work, doesn't penetrate, you speak again and again and again. Then what's the connection to Lag BaOmer? The connection is in the words of Rashi, which is taken from the Talmud. What is the reason why the word Amor say and V'amarta and say to them repeated? So the elders should admonish the younger. Now the word for admonishing here in Hebrew is lehazhir. The root of that word is Zohar, which means to bring light. Yes, you're admonishing them, but you're doing it with love, with light. And that's the name of the book of the Zohar, the book of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the book of mysticism that brings light to the world because it is the inner light of the Torah. So we have a connection to all the holidays, including the rabbinical holidays of Hanukkah and Purim, including Pesach Sheni, which is biblical, but it's not a holiday that is very prominent. And then we also have a connection to Lag BaOmer. By extension, we also have a connection to Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, the Hasidic holiday, where the Alter Rebbe was released from prison, and it marked the beginning of a new era of disseminating the teachings of Hasidus, which are the light, the luminary, the luminescence of Torah, if you will. Again, related to the word lahasir, to bring light. And if we delve a little bit deeper, we'll see that all, even insignificant holidays, are all somehow hinted in this parsha. The Torah goes on to talk about, change the topic, the laws concerning a Cohen. A Cohen is not allowed to come into contact with the dead. A Cohen to serve in the temple cannot be blemished. Let's focus on these two things. Why is it that a Cohen cannot come in contact with the dead? Can only come to the funeral of his close relatives, but no one else. Unless there's no one else to do the burial, that's called a mace mitzvah, that even the high priest has to interrupt what he's doing and bury that dead person. But otherwise, if there are other people who can do it, the Kohen, not just the high priest, any Kohen cannot come in contact with the dead except for the closest of relatives. Why? What's the logic behind it? One of the explanations is that when we look around to find expressions of God, where does God manifest himself? Well, the first answer is, obviously, in the things that we do to serve God. We do a mitzvah. So we're focused on God. We generate godly energy. We study Torah. We're studying divine wisdom. But where in nature is God present? The answer is in life. That's why Judaism so cherishes life, because life is what God says to us, I am showing you my face. I'm giving you a manifestation of who I am within the natural world. That's where we see God's presence in life. And that's why whenever there's a cessation of life or a curtailment of life, obscuring of life, the person is called tameh. He's unclean. Now, it doesn't mean he's physically unclean. It doesn't mean he's bad. You do a sin, then you are spiritually unclean because of your negative behavior. But if you go to sleep, for example, when part of your soul leaves your body, you're less animated, life is a little bit restricted, you become receptive to that which is considered unclean, defiled, impure, and you have to wash your hands in the morning to remove whatever vestiges of impurity might still be left after a long night's sleep. So, that's one example. The ultimate example of God concealing himself is when someone, God forbid, passes away, and the soul completely leaves the body. That is a state of impurity, and coming in contact with that means that you have touched physically and figuratively the realm of God's sealing presence. Because God is there even when he's concealed, but it's a concealed presence. A Cohen's job is to connect to God's revealed presence. Not everyone could connect to God's revealed presence all the time. We do it when we pray, when we study Torah, when we do a mitzvah, on a holiday, Shabbos. But the Cohen, he had to be, so to speak, completely, totally devoted to being in a place where God's presence is the very least curtailed as possible. And that's why he wasn't allowed to come into contact with the dead. But then there's a little bit more of a problem. Why is the Cohen, who is blemished, who has a severe physical defect, not permitted to do the service in the temple? That seems to go against everything we've been told in the modern times, that we shouldn't discriminate against those who are physically challenged. And here there was upright discrimination. A Cohen who was physically blemished could not serve in the temple. So I'm going to give you a very brief answer that requires a lot more explanation and elaboration, but just leave you with some insight to reflect on. We know that everything in this world that exists in the physical realm has a parallel spiritual force. There's no such thing as something that's physical that doesn't have a parallel spiritual force. And the physical and the spiritual work in tandem. There's an alignment between them. So whatever happens in the spiritual realm should also happen in the physical realm. Whatever happens in the physical realm is a reflection, it should be, of what exists in the spiritual realm. That is the way it ought to be, but it's not necessarily that way. That was the way it was when God's presence was clearly aligned with the physical world. A person did a mitzvah. That mitzvah had a direct effect on the physicality of the world. A person who was not well did not have to go to a doctor in the days when we had the temple and prophets, but went to his mentor to correct whatever spiritual defect he or she had, and that would immediately translate in the correction of the physical ailment, because the physical and the spiritual worked in tandem. That's the way it ought to be. A perfect world, the ideal world, although we're so accustomed to the imperfect world, the misaligned world, the true world and the ultimate world is one in which the physical and the spiritual go together. Good people will beget good results. Evil will beget evil. Today, if that would have happened throughout history, every time you did a mitzvah, you'd see an aura around the person, and the person would be rewarded with wealth and health. And every time you did something wrong, you would get zapped by a bolt of lightning. There would be no free choice. But ultimately, that's how the world will become. A model of that perfection, of that messianic utopia, which is characterized by this alignment between the physical and the spiritual, between good and good results. A model of that was in the temple. The temple was the place where God's presence was revealed, in the sense that the physical and the spiritual had to match one another. In today's world, if someone is physically challenged, physically disabled, disfigured, it has absolutely no reflection on their inner spirit. In fact, the Talmud tells a story that Rabbi Yehoshua, the greatest sage, was rather a very unattractive-looking person, to the point that the princess said to him, "Why would God put such a beautiful soul and mind, such an ugly body?" And he told her to take her father's wine and put it in golden barrels instead of the earthenware, and all the wine spoiled. So he used that as a metaphor that sometimes the most beautiful things are in ugly, unbecoming vessels. But that's not the ideal. That's the way it is, and we're here to bring together the physical and the spiritual. In the temple, the Cohen had to be a reflection of the spiritual to show that that's the ideal, that the physical and the spiritual work in tandem. Leaving you with that thought, do some more reflection on it, and we'll revisit it, God willing, some other time. One of the commandments in the Torah is to count the days of Sphira, as I mentioned at the very beginning. After Passover, it means the second day, the Torah refers to it as the day after Shabbos. And it doesn't refer to Shabbos, it refers to the holiday, which is called Shabbos, because it's a day of rest. You count 49 days. Actually, the Torah says you count 50 days, but it means counting up to 50. And the Torah also says to count 7 weeks. Why were we commanded to count those days? So the Midrash says because the Jews, when they left Egypt, counted the days because they were so eager to get the Torah. In mystical sources, especially in Hasidus, the explanation is given that when we left Egypt, we had a long way to go before we were worthy to receive the Torah. We had to refine ourselves. And since the part that we have to refine is the emotional part, the way we express our feelings of love, of fear, of whatever the emotion may be, and there are a total of 7, and each one of these 7 consists of the other 7. Every day is devoted to refining another one of those attributes. So we count the days not just to see how many days we have left. On the contrary, we count them in ascending order. Each day we have another day, another accomplishment, another refining result. And in the aggregate, when we reach the 49th day, we have achieved a complete form of refinement, and then we're ready to get the Torah. Now, most people who count don't feel that they're changing themselves, they're refining themselves. And the answer to that is that, true, the ideal is that when we count, we should also introspect, we should also focus on that specific trait. But the beauty of Judaism is that when we do a mitzvah, even with minimal feeling and minimal intent, the mitzvah itself generates the energy of refinement, especially when the mitzvah is geared to refinement. Every mitzvah we do refines us, but that's not necessarily the objective of every mitzvah. But the mitzvah of counting the days is especially directed towards that goal of refinement. So merely counting has that effect, and if we don't feel it, Hasidus gives the analogy, it's like a person that puts money in the bank. They can't spend it while it's in the bank, but eventually they will be able to withdraw it. And that's what happens during the counting of this period. We're putting spiritual refinement capital in our bank. As I mentioned before, Lag BaOmer is the day in which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away, not before he revealed some of the secrets of the Torah. Now, I'd like to just focus and dwell for a few moments on the significance of Lag BaOmer. Lag is a number, as I said a few minutes before. But if you rearrange the letters, you can put it any way you like. It reads Gal. The word Gal in Hebrew has 2 meanings. One meaning is a pile of rocks that forms a barrier. in the news we're hearing about building walls. Judaism also has walls, and God paid for it. He set them up. Barriers. We don't mix things that shouldn't be mixed. Just like you can't mix certain chemicals, you'll get an explosion if you do. Certain things are intended to be mixed and intermingled. And God knows the parameters when we could mix things and when we have to create barriers. There's a barrier between the revealed part of Torah and between the hidden part of Torah. Kabbalah, mysticism, was always around. It was given at Mount Sinai together with the laws of the Torah, but were intended to be hidden and revealed to only a select few spiritually elite people. There was a gal, there was a pile. And that is reminiscent of the story in the Torah in Genesis where Jacob and his uncle, father-in-law, and Uncle Lavan agreed to set up a barrier between them so they don't encroach on each other's territory. That's division. However, there's a caveat there. It says we won't cross over that barrier to cause harm, but for good, for trade, for commerce, yes, we will allow immigration. We will allow traversing this barrier. And the same thing is true with the barrier between the revealed and the hidden. There are two types of barriers. There's one type of barrier that can never be removed. It's an absolute one. There's an absolute barrier between Shabbos and the weekdays. We observe Shabbos on the seventh day of the week, and the other 6 days we do work. If a person will say, I want to keep Shabbos all week long, there's no virtue in that. If a person wants to make Shabbos into a weekday, there's absolutely something absolutely negative. So there are certain barriers that can never be removed, but then there are barriers that are intended to be temporary. The perfect analogy would be a stop sign. A stop sign tells you to stop, but it's not intended to keep you there. You're supposed to stop, look in all four directions, and then proceed. The division between the revealed and the hidden, that the hidden had to remain hidden, was intended to be removed. Just like at Sinai, God removed an earlier barrier between the heaven and the earth. The Torah, which gives us the power to make this world into a divine place, didn't exist before Sinai. There was a barrier, and God removed it at Sinai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the first step in removing a second barrier between the revealed and the hidden. And that's why it's such a great celebration. And the word gal, which means pile of stones, also means expose. As King David says, gal einai, open up my eyes, expose my eyes. And this ties in with the first reason of Lag BaOmer. Why do we observe Lag BaOmer? For the first reason, because the students of Rabbi Akiva who died in the plague ceased dying. Why did they die? Because they couldn't treat each other with respect. Why do people not treat each other with respect? Because there's a certain type of conflict between them. Why is there conflict? Because they represent two different and disparate forces that are competing with one another. One is trespassing on the turf of the other. But if we follow the inner dimension of what each individual is, if we go to the soul, to the pnimius, then we're all one, we're all connected, and there's no threat to one another, there's no trespassing, there's no rivalry, which is the ultimate goal. Mashiach comes, there will be no longer any jealousy or rivalry. The whole world will have this experience, this tremendous unity. Well, where did that sense of unity come from? It only could happen when you reveal the hidden. If you look at the surface, there's so many differences, so many barriers. When you probe beneath the surface, you see how all those barriers fall away. So the second reason for Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's revealing the inner dimension of Torah, is also the antidote to the problem that brought about the need for this first reason of Lag BaOmer. Just one other point. At the end of the Parsha, it's a sad story of someone who cursed God and he was actually executed, which is a rare occurrence, even though Judaism does allow capital punishment, but it's a very rare occurrence. However, the Torah ends after talking about how he was executed, It says, Ubnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, Osu kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe, did as God had commanded Moses. Why is that necessary to have been added? Telling the story that the Jews did what they were, it says clearly that God told Moses to do this, and Moses told the Jews, and they did it. So why does it have to emphasize they did it because God told Moses? And here's a very simple and historical explanation. It's interesting that Jews have always felt uncomfortable with the idea of using harsh measures, even to punish those who deserve it. Jews were always not excited about fighting wars. Do they fight wars? Yes. Are wars sometimes necessary? Tragically, yes. But Jews have never glorified war. We're now going to be observing 50 years of the Six-Day War. And I remember when a Israeli veteran of the, I think it was the Yom Kippur War, told me that after a few hours on the battlefield, he couldn't pull the trigger anymore. And it wasn't because of fatigue. It was because he couldn't imagine killing another human being. Now, usually we become inured after so many hundreds of shootings in self-defense, of course. Not just for yourself, but protecting your whole country. You would become inured. You would become desensitized. No. It's something that's in the genes, in the DNA of the Jewish people, conditioned this way, that we love life and we hate to do anything to take life, even of an enemy. The Torah says you are commanded to do it. You have forced to do it. They did it not because they enjoyed doing it. If you look at the terrible spectacles all over the world where people are executed and crowds are watching and celebrating, this is not just ancient history. This is modern times. And the Jewish people could never get themselves to accept with comfort the idea of destruction, because our ultimate goal is not fighting wars, even wars of self-defense. Our ultimate goal is the Messianic age, which will be a period of universal peace, of true peace, and we will no longer have to worry about being desensitized. But we were desensitized even in the past when we had to fight, and we pray and hope that that won't even be necessary anymore. Have a good Shabbos.